Something happened 100,000 years before Luke Skywalker was born. A woman drank from two wells. That is it. That is the moment. A single mortal being, driven by love and desperation, made a choice on a forgotten jungle world. And what came out of that moment was so powerful, so utterly beyond anything that existed before or after, that the greatest cosmic engineers in galactic history had to build a prison out of chained black holes just to contain it. A prison that held for tens of thousands of years. A prison that almost did not hold long enough. That is where this story ends. But to understand why it matters, you need to understand everything that came before it. The name Darth Vader probably came to mind when you clicked this. Maybe Palpatine, maybe Yoda, maybe Revan. If you have been deep in the lore long enough, every one of those answers is reasonable. Every one of them is wrong. Because the question of who was the most powerful Force user in the history of this galaxy has an answer that most people never find. Because finding it requires going back further than the Sith, further than the Jedi, further than the Republic itself. It requires going back to a time when the Force was not a tradition or a philosophy or a weapon, but a living family, a father, a son, a daughter, and a mortal woman who loved them so much that she destroyed herself trying to protect them, and in doing so, became something the galaxy had no name for. What follows is that full story. Every serious contender, every claim to the title, from the oldest powers ever to touch the Force, all the way to the last Skywalker standing. This is not a ranked list. It is a case, built piece by piece, era by era, until the answer is the only thing left standing. The power we are measuring is not simple. A being who can destroy a planet is terrifying. But a being who can survive anything, sustain themselves across centuries, bend living minds, without those minds ever knowing it happened, that is something different. Something more complete. We are going to be looking at raw destructive output, survivability across time, dominance over life and death as concepts, and the degree to which a being does not merely use the Force, but becomes it. Keep that framework in mind, because every name in this story fits it differently, and the one that fits it most completely is not the one you expect. There was a time before the Jedi, before the Sith, before the Republic, before anything you would recognize as civilization. A time when the galaxy was not yet a collection of inhabited worlds connected by hyperlanes and shared history, but something more like raw material, something waiting to be shaped. And there were beings who shaped it. They are called the Celestials. What the Celestials actually were, in terms of biology or origin, has never been fully established. Ancient records from the Killik hive mind, one of the oldest sources of collective memory in the galaxy, describe them as beings of immense power, who may have started as mortal creatures and evolved into something so far beyond mortality that the distinction stopped meaning anything. Some accounts suggest they could change their physical form at will. Others describe them as existing partly as living energy, merged with the Force in ways that are difficult to conceptualize from a mortal perspective. What they left behind, though, is not ambiguous at all. The Celestials built the Corellian system, not colonized it, not settled it, built it. The 5 inhabitable worlds of that system sit in circular orbits so geometrically precise that every astronomer who has ever studied them has arrived at the same conclusion. This configuration cannot occur naturally. Someone put those planets there, held them in place, and engineered the gravitational relationships between them with a precision that defies anything technology has since been able to replicate. The tool they used was called Centerpoint Station, a construct so massive it could reach into hyperspace and drag celestial bodies from one location to another, repositioning them like objects on a table. They did the same with the Hapis cluster, with the Cathol region, with the Volta system. Each of these construction projects required the manipulation of gravity and space on a scale that still bends comprehension thousands of years later. But none of those achievements were the most extreme thing the Celestials ever built. That distinction belongs to the Maw. The Maw is a cluster of black holes near Kessel. Not black holes that happen to cluster together through natural cosmic processes. Black holes that the Celestials gathered from different points across the galaxy and arranged into a specific formation, deliberately, purposefully, as a construction project. They used singularities, objects that represent the most extreme physical phenomena the universe produces, as building materials. They turned the fabric of space-time itself into a tool for their designs. Why would anyone do this? Why build a prison made of black holes? That question gets answered a little later, when we discuss what they needed to imprison. For now, the point is simply this: the Celestials operated at a level that has never been matched by any civilization before or since. They were not Force users in the way a Jedi or Sith is a Force user. They were something closer to the universe's own architects, and the Force was the medium through which they worked. They are not, however, the answer to our question. Because the Celestials, as powerful as they were, are not what this conversation is actually about. They are the context. They are the world in which the answer was born. While the Celestials ruled the galaxy and built their cosmic wonders, something else emerged. Something that did not come from the existing order of things, but rose out of the Force itself. The Killik hive mind, the Ruukt memory, preserved an account of what happened, passed down through millions of years of shared insect consciousness. According to that ancient memory, on a lush jungle world, from a single geyser of pure Force energy, 3 beings came into existence. They did not grow up. They did not develop over time. They simply appeared, already fully formed, already impossibly powerful, already something that had no proper category in any existing understanding of the Force. A father, a daughter, a son. These 3 beings would eventually be called the Ones. And they were not Force users. They were the Force, given shape and personality and will. The father embodied balance, not as a philosophy or a practice, but as his literal nature. He was the equilibrium between all things. The daughter represented what older cultures called Ashla, the light side, the current of creation and healing and life. The son represented what was known as Bogan, the dark side, the current of change and ambition and entropy. Together, the 3 of them were not simply in tune with the Force. They were its fundamental nature made flesh. They made their home on a world where the Force ran stronger than anywhere else in the galaxy. A place with 2 locations of extreme cosmic significance. The first was the font of power, a wellspring of pure dark side energy, concentrated to levels that would be lethal to any ordinary Force sensitive. The second was the pool of knowledge, a body of water imbued with pure light-side insight, wisdom, and power gathered over the entire history of the galaxy. The Father knew what these places were. He understood exactly how dangerous they could be. He forbade his children from ever using them, not as a casual rule, but as a matter of survival. Those wells were not tools. They were concentrated sources of fundamental cosmic energy, and no being, not even beings as powerful as the son and daughter, was meant to channel both at once. For a long time, the family lived in something close to harmony. The daughter wandered the forests of their world, nurturing the plants and animals around her, extending the light side's creative energy outward in every direction. The son explored the caves and shadows, testing his limits, learning the depths of what darkness could do and what it could reveal. The father moved between them, maintaining the balance, watching them both with the particular attention of someone who understood exactly what would happen if either of them went too far. But eventually, as always, the boundaries started to shift. The son grew curious. He was the embodiment of the dark side, and the dark side does not accept limits gracefully. He began to wonder where his power actually ended. What would happen if he pushed further than he ever had before? What would the font of power give him if he chose to use it? He knew his father had forbidden it. He also knew that he was not like other beings, that he was darkness itself walking in a body, and that the font was his in some fundamental way that went beyond what any rule could properly contain. So he drank from it. The explosion of power that followed was unlike anything he had experienced before. The dark side energy that flooded through him did not simply add to what he already was. It amplified every aspect of his nature to levels that no longer had a proper measure. His strength in the Force multiplied in ways that made his previous power look like something preliminary, like a sketch before a finished work. And when the daughter sensed what her brother had done, she did not come to rebuke him. She saw the transformation and made her own choice. She found the pool of knowledge and submerged herself in its light side waters. The result was the same kind of amplification, only with the opposite polarity. Creation and healing became more powerful in her than they had ever been. Light side insight flooded through every part of her being. But what happened next was what the father had been afraid of all along. The son and daughter, now both operating at the amplified level their respective wells had given them, began to fight. These were not ordinary arguments between siblings. When two beings who embody opposite sides of the Force at that level of power clash, the consequences extend far beyond the people involved. Their battles shook mountains. They split the sky. Forests burned in patterns that followed the movement of their conflict. The ground itself reacted to the Force energies being unleashed upon it. The father threw himself between them, spending every moment of every day trying to prevent one from destroying the other, trying to keep the galaxy itself from coming apart at the seams under the pressure of what his children had become. And the records say something that sounds like it should be poetic exaggeration, but is not. The battles between the son and daughter altered the current of the Force. The flow of time and destiny changed because of what they were doing to each other. When beings of that magnitude, representing the absolute poles of the Force, go to war, the ripples do not stop at the edge of their world. They spread through the Force the way cracks spread through ice, touching everything, changing something fundamental about the nature of the galaxy in ways that would not be fully understood for thousands of years. This is the context into which the woman who would become Abeloth arrived. Her name has been lost. It was never recorded, or the records that contained it did not survive. She came to the world of the Ones as something ordinary, a servant, a caretaker, with no particular cosmic significance beyond the capacity to care deeply about the beings she served. She cooked, she cleaned, she offered companionship to a family of Force gods who existed on a level she could barely comprehend. And over time, because she was good at what she did and because she was genuinely kind, the Ones began to call her something they had never called anyone before. They called her the Mother, not because she had given birth to them. They predated her by an incomprehensible span. They called her that because she filled the role with a warmth and a wisdom that none of them had ever known. She was the first being to stand between the son and daughter and make them pause. She had no force power to speak of compared to theirs. She had no cosmic authority. What she had was something they had never encountered: genuine, patient, unconditional love. When tensions rose and the siblings prepared to tear into each other again, she would step in and remind them of what they meant to each other. She found ways to redirect the son's destructive impulses into something constructive. She smoothed over the daughter's righteous anger before it could ignite into something that threatened to destroy everything around it. For the first time since they had drunk from the forbidden wells, the son and daughter achieved something resembling peace. The family functioned. The father's burden lightened, all because of one mortal woman who had no power except the power of genuine affection. But she was mortal. That was the tragedy at the center of everything that followed. The Ones existed outside of time in many ways. They did not age the way living creatures age. Their bodies did not weaken with the passing years. They were going to remain exactly as they were for as long as the Force itself continued to exist. The Mother had no such protection. Time moved through her the way it moves through everything mortal. Her hair went gray. Lines appeared on her face. Her body grew frailer, even as the family around her stayed perfectly, eternally unchanged. She watched herself decline and felt, beneath the warmth she had always carried, a rising terror, because she knew what would happen when she died. She could see it clearly. The father would be left alone to manage his children, without her to mediate, without her to steady the son's darkness, without her voice to remind the daughter that fury unchecked becomes destruction. The peace she had worked so hard to build would crack and then shatter, and the battles would begin again. And this time, there might be nobody left to stop them from going all the way to the end. She could not let that happen. She had learned about the font of power and the pool of knowledge. She knew the father had forbidden anyone from using them, but she also knew that the son and daughter had used them anyway. She had watched the transformation those wells created. She had seen what happened when a being consumed their energy, and she started to reason it through from the place of someone who loves so desperately that the fear of losing what they love becomes indistinguishable from the need to do something about it. If one well granted incredible power, she thought, what would both of them do together? If you could combine the font's dark side energy with the pool's light side wisdom, you might gain everything the Ones had. You might become like them. You might live forever and keep your family safe for all eternity, and never have to face the grief of leaving the people you loved behind. The logic felt sound to someone who was afraid. One day, the son and daughter fell into one of their arguments. The father rushed between them, trying to separate them before things escalated. In the chaos of that distraction, the mother slipped away. She found the font of power first. She stood before it and felt its dark energy pulsing outward like a second heartbeat, raw and vast and waiting. She did not hesitate. She drank from it. The dark side energy that flooded through her was not something a mortal body was built to contain. It was not something a mortal mind was structured to process. It felt like being struck by lightning and drowned simultaneously, like having every fear and every love and every desperate impulse you had ever felt amplified to a volume that left no room for anything else. But she did not stop there. She ran to the pool of knowledge and threw herself into its waters. Light side energy poured through her in the opposite direction. Infinite wisdom and ancient insight, and the collected understanding of the Force across all its history, meeting the dark side power already burning through her veins. Two opposite energies met inside a mortal body that was never designed to hold either one, let alone both at once. The father sensed it immediately. He ran to the pool and used the Force to pull her out of the water. He was too late. The transformation had already completed. What rose from the surface of that pool was not the woman who had walked in. The being who emerged had been remade at every level, physically, mentally, spiritually. She was immortal now. Yes, exactly as she had hoped. But immortality was not the only thing the wells had given her. Everything good in her had been corrupted. The love had become obsession. The desire to protect had become a need to control. The wisdom had curdled into cunning madness. The compassion that had once calmed a family of Force gods had transformed into an insatiable hunger that no amount of consuming would ever satisfy. She was still recognizable in fragments, still wearing the face and voice of the woman the ones had called their mother. But the interior was something entirely different, something the galaxy had never seen before. She had become Abeloth, the bringer of chaos, and she was more powerful than anyone had ever anticipated. She turned on the son and daughter first. She hit them with storms of Force energy that made their own amplified abilities look like something preliminary. The two beings who embodied the absolute poles of the Force, who had fought each other to a standstill countless times, and who had each been empowered by the wells they had drunk from, found themselves driven to their knees by the thing that had once made them tea and reminded them to speak kindly to one another. They bowed before her, or risked being destroyed on the spot. This had never happened before. There was no category for it. The son and daughter were living representations of the Force's fundamental nature. Nothing was supposed to be able to make them submit. Abeloth did it easily. She called herself the beloved Queen of the Stars. In her corrupted mind, she believed she was still doing what she had always done. Protecting her family, keeping them together, making sure they would never be separated. She would keep them safe by ruling over them. They would be hers forever, under her control, incapable of leaving or fighting or hurting each other. She had become exactly what the father had feared when he first forbade anyone from touching those wells. A being with power on the level of a god, and no wisdom left to guide what she did with it. Her transformation sent shockwaves through the Force that reached every corner of the galaxy. If you had been Force-sensitive anywhere in the known galaxy at that moment, you would have felt something deeply wrong. A scream in the fabric of reality. A cold wave of dread with no apparent source. Animals across countless worlds panicked for no reason they could identify. Stars seemed to dim. The air felt heavier. Force-sensitive species reported nightmares of a dark presence awakening, something vast and hungry stirring at the edges of consciousness. Chaos had been born. and it wore the face of a woman who had only ever wanted to protect the people she loved. The father understood what had to be done. He was heartbroken in a way that only a being who genuinely loved someone can be heartbroken, watching the person who had brought peace to his broken family become the single greatest threat in the history of the galaxy. He put duty first. He got the son and daughter away from Abeloth, separating them from the immediate danger she posed. And then he sent a call through the Force to every Celestial who still remained. This was not a request. This was an emergency mobilization. The Celestials answered. Every servant species they had cultivated over millennia answered with them. The Kilik, with their hive mind coordination, able to direct thousands of workers as a single consciousness. The Gree, with their advanced technology. The Qua from Dathomir, with their force sensitivity. Every being who had ever worked under celestial guidance came together for one purpose: to stop Abeloth before she unraveled the order that had taken hundreds of thousands of years to build. The war that followed has no formal name in the records, but scholars who have pieced it together from fragments of Kilik memory and ancient Jedi texts sometimes call it the War of the Force Gods. It was a conflict unlike any other in galactic history, not because of the weapons used or the battles fought, but because of what was at stake. Abeloth was not trying to conquer territory or accumulate resources. She was chaos made conscious. And chaos does not want to win so much as it wants everything to come apart. Left unchecked, she would not simply have destroyed the Celestials. She would have unraveled the structure of the Force itself, undone the foundations of the ordered galaxy her makers had spent so long constructing. The father could not simply fight her and win. She was too powerful for direct confrontation. She had consumed both the font and the pool, which meant she had the absolute extremes of both the dark and light sides of the Force running through her simultaneously. And the combination had produced something greater than the sum of its parts, something that exceeded even the individual power of the son and daughter who had each taken one well between them. What the father needed was a prison, not a physical cell, though that was part of it. He needed a trap made of the most extreme physical forces the galaxy could produce, one so absolute in its properties that even Abeloth could not simply force her way through it the moment she chose to. He worked with the Celestials and their servant species to build the Maw. They gathered black holes from across the galaxy. They positioned them with the precision that only beings with celestial-level mastery of gravity and space could achieve. They chained the singularities together into a cluster whose combined gravitational properties would create a region of space that no ship and no being could navigate without specific knowledge of the paths through it. But the black holes alone were not enough. The Maw needed an anchor, something that could actively maintain the prison's structure, rather than simply relying on passive gravitational force. That anchor was Centerpoint Station. The station that had originally been built to move planets was repurposed to maintain the Maw's equilibrium, holding the configuration of black holes in its designed formation and ensuring that the prison remained functional across whatever span of time proved necessary. They drove Abeloth into the Maw. They sealed it behind her, and the War of the Force Gods came to an end. But victory came at a catastrophic price. The effort of building the Maw, of fighting Abeloth, of wielding Centerpoint Station at the level required to accomplish everything the imprisonment demanded, had broken the Celestials. The war had not simply cost lives. It had drained their civilization at a fundamental level, exhausting the power and cohesion that had maintained their dominance over the galaxy for so long. Around 30,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, the Celestials simply vanished. The records do not explain exactly what happened. They may have died. They may have departed for somewhere outside the galaxy. They may have evolved into something so far beyond their previous form that they became invisible to conventional observation. Whatever the cause, the galaxy they had built and maintained for so long was suddenly without its architects, and the servant species they had empowered, seeing the opportunity in their master's absence, made their move. The Rakata had always been the most ambitious of the Celestials' servants. Originally a species of Force-sensitive beings from a world called Leon, they had been taken under celestial guidance and shaped into builders, enforcers, and administrators of various celestial projects. In the process, they had watched their masters and learned. They had observed how the Force could be channeled through technology, how sufficiently advanced machinery could multiply the raw power of Force-sensitive users into something that operated on a planetary and eventually a stellar scale. When the Celestials weakened, the Rakata did not mourn. They revolted. They hunted down any remaining Celestials they could find and eliminated them, seizing their master's tools and legacy for themselves. What followed was the Infinite Empire. Not infinite in the literal sense, though at its height it would control hundreds of worlds stretching across a significant portion of the known galaxy. The Rakata built their dominion on the same principle the Celestials had pioneered. Force channeled through technology, but with a crucial difference in purpose. Where the Celestials had used their power to build and maintain order, the Rakata used theirs to dominate and extract. Their ships were powered by dark side energy. Their weapons operated on the same principle. Their hyperdrives connected directly to the Force, which meant that non-Force sensitive species could not operate Rakata technology at all, locking their enslaved populations into complete technological dependence. The pinnacle of Rakata achievement was the Star Forge, a space station built in the Lehon system, constructed around a star, drawing directly on the energy of both the stellar body and the dark side of the Force simultaneously. The Star Forge could produce war material at a rate that conventional manufacturing could not approach. Ships, weapons, equipment, all of it poured out of the forge in quantities that would have seemed impossible to any other civilization. More troubling, the station grew more powerful over time, the more it was used, because it was designed to feed on the dark side energies flowing through whatever was built within it, amplifying its output in a feedback loop that had no natural ceiling. At their peak, the Rakata were the most technologically advanced civilization in galactic history, and almost certainly the most powerful Force-wielding culture the mortal galaxy had ever produced. Their warlords did not simply move planets. They depopulated them. They enslaved species on a scale that made later Sith empires look restrained by comparison. They shaped their corner of the galaxy through a combination of direct Force ability and technologically amplified Force power that gave them an effective reach far beyond what any individual could manage. But they had an essential weakness built into everything they were. Their Force sensitivity was entirely oriented toward the dark side. Their connection to the Force was rooted in domination and consumption and cruelty, and that connection had become inseparable from their physical biology. When a plague swept through the Rakata civilization roughly 25,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, it did not destroy their bodies. It did something more precise. It severed their connection to the Force. An entire species of Force users lost their ability to touch the energy field that had powered everything they built. Their hyperdrives failed. Their weapons stopped working. the Star Forge became inaccessible. Their slaves saw the window and rose up, and the Infinite Empire, the greatest mortal force-wielding civilization in galactic history, collapsed within a few centuries. The Rakata are relevant to this conversation because, at their height, they demonstrate what happens when force power is filtered through technology and scaled to a civilizational level. But no individual Rakata, even the most powerful warlord among them, could hold a candle to what was coming in the subsequent millennia of Sith history. The Rakata's power was institutional. What we are moving toward now is something personal, something concentrated into a single being rather than distributed across a species and its machinery. Before we get to the Sith, though, we need to return to Abeloth, because her story does not end with the Maw. She was immortal. She was patient. She was connected to the Force in a way that no prison built from physical materials could permanently sever. Over the tens of thousands of years that followed her imprisonment, she found ways to slip free. The Killik hive mind records the pattern with the methodical precision of a species that had witnessed it happen more than once. Abeloth could escape whenever the current of the Force was sufficiently disturbed. Major imbalances, catastrophic events, moments when the Force bent far enough out of its normal flow, created cracks in the Maw's containment that she could exploit. Each time she escaped, chaos followed. Stars flickered. Mass extinctions occurred on multiple worlds with no apparent cause. Force-sensitive beings across the galaxy reported nightmares and madness and visions of something ancient and hungry moving through the dark between worlds. And then, each time, she was recaptured. The father, or after his eventual passing, the son and daughter working together, would track her down and drive her back into the Maw. The cycle would reset. The prison would hold. The galaxy would exhale. Scholars looking back at pre-Republic history have noticed a recurring pattern of mysterious catastrophes with no clear cause. Around 100,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, around the time of Abeloth's first imprisonment, evidence shows mass extinctions across multiple core worlds and climate shifts that wiped out entire species. Around 30,000 years before Yavin, when the Celestials vanished and the Rakata revolted, there are suggestions that Abeloth may have escaped during the chaos of that transition, possibly even contributing to the final collapse of celestial civilization. Around 15,000 years before Yavin, something that some scholars call the Fulcrum Winter saw stars dim across the galaxy and species disappear for no apparent reason. The pattern fits: periods of stability, then sudden waves of unexplained catastrophe, then stability again, as though some vast unseen threat was periodically breaking loose and being recaptured over and over across a timeline so long that individual mortal civilizations rose and fell between each cycle without ever understanding what was really happening above their heads. What finally ended this cycle, and how it connects to the central question of this video, is something we will come back to in detail. But the point is already established. In terms of raw power, in terms of what Abeloth was able to do, she represents a tier that nothing mortal has ever cleanly matched. She forced the son and daughter of the Force itself to their knees. She required a prison made of black holes to contain her. She survived tens of thousands of years of confinement and still managed to periodically break free. No Jedi, no Sith, no Force user in the conventional mortal sense of that term has ever operated at the level Abeloth demonstrated at her full power. But this is a story about Force users, plural. And there are mortal beings whose power was extraordinary enough to demand serious consideration even against that backdrop. And one of them was born long after the age of gods had ended, in a corner of the galaxy that the great cosmic powers of earlier ages had long since ceased to watch over. He was born on a Sith world called Medrias. And he was not born a monster, he became one. The records describe his childhood in terms that are almost too bleak to sit with. His father was the lord of their world. Not a kind lord, not a neutral administrator, but a being who used his position the way every tool of power gets used when the person holding it has no restraint, to take what he wanted and punish whatever challenged him. His mother lived in misery. The household was a place of fear, and the child who was born into it was something his parents did not understand and could not control. From the earliest years anyone can document, the boy who would eventually call himself Tenebrae demonstrated force abilities that had no comparison anywhere in the Sith world where he lived. He did not study the Force. He did not train in it under a master or develop it gradually through practice and discipline. He simply had it in a quantity and depth that suggested something had gone wrong in the normal distribution of Force sensitivity, that all the power that might have been spread across a generation had concentrated itself in one person for reasons nobody could explain. He was 6 years old the first time he used that power deliberately. His father had been cruel to his mother again. Cruelty of a specific kind that the child had witnessed enough times to understand completely, and had decided, in that quiet way of someone who has never had reason to question their own capabilities, would not happen anymore. He used the Force to kill the man. He was 6 years old. The act was not frenzied or panicked. It was controlled, precise. The records suggest he planned it. And when it was done, he did not run or hide or show any visible distress. He simply moved on. What followed in the years between 6 and 13 is a record of accelerating consolidation. The boy identified the other Force-sensitive individuals on his world with an efficiency that suggested he could sense them clearly, as though their power announced itself to him at distances that should have been impossible, and he began systematically to absorb them, not in any metaphorical sense. He hunted them down. He killed most. Those he did not kill, he broke, mentally and spiritually, until their will was no longer their own but simply an extension of his. By the time he was 13, every Force-sensitive being on the planet Medrias had been either killed or enslaved. He had consumed the Force potential of an entire world's worth of gifted individuals before he was old enough to have studied much of anything about what he was doing. He renamed his world Nathema. And then he traveled to Ziost. Ziost was the capital of the old Sith Empire at the time, and the being who ruled it was Marka Ragnos, acknowledged by every Sith Lord of that era as the most powerful among them. Ragnos had ruled for so long and defeated so many challengers that his authority was as close to absolute as mortal Sith authority ever got. When the 13-year-old boy arrived and requested an audience, the guards presumably found the request interesting enough to relay it upward. What Ragnos saw when he looked at this child was something he had not encountered in centuries of ruling over Sith Lords and navigating the most treacherous political environment in the galaxy. He saw a depth of dark side power that was not simply greater than he had expected from someone so young. It was greater than he had expected from anyone, period. The dark side energy radiating from this teenager was unlike anything Ragnos had encountered in his entire life. He granted the boy the title of Lord, which no Sith ruler had ever done for someone that young, and he did it not out of sentiment or strategy, but out of the simple recognition that this was not a being you denied anything if you had any choice in the matter. The boy accepted the title. He returned to Nathema, and then he spent the next century studying, waiting, and planning, while other Sith Lords schemed against each other for position and prestige, while the political landscape of the Empire churned with the usual ambitions and betrayals. The being now called Lord Vitiate remained on Nathema and did almost nothing visible at all. He built a palace on the exact spot where his childhood home had stood, which is the kind of symbolic statement that tells you something important about how he thought about his own history. He took on students, young Sith who had heard rumors of a master who taught differently from the norm, who preached patience and calculated fury over wild passion and uncontrolled rage. He let his reputation exist in the background without pushing it. He was accumulating the way water accumulates behind a dam, building pressure so gradually that nobody noticed how much had gathered. When the Great Hyperspace War erupted between the old Sith Empire and the Galactic Republic, Vitiate made a choice that his contemporaries never forgave and never quite understood. He refused to fight, while every other significant Sith Lord committed forces to the war. He sat on Nathema and watched. They called him a coward, a scholar who played with books while real Sith fought and bled and died for their empire. They were exactly wrong about his reasons and exactly right about one thing. He was planning while they were dying. The war ended in total catastrophe for the Sith. Republic forces crushed their armies. The Battle of Korriban broke the back of Sith resistance. Ancient bloodlines ended overnight as Jedi moved through the Empire's shattered remnants hunting survivors. The great houses and old families that had defined Sith civilization for millennia ceased to exist in the span of a few years of brutal military defeat. When the smoke cleared and the Republic declared victory, the galaxy believed the Sith were finished. Vitiate had positioned himself perfectly. He had lost nothing. His power was intact. His world was untouched. His rivals had eliminated themselves by fighting an unwinnable war on someone else's timetable. And now the survivors of those once great Sith houses were scattered, terrified, and desperately searching for something that looked like hope. He gave it to them. He broadcast across the ruins of the Empire, reaching every hidden enclave and refugee camp where Sith Lords were cowering from Jedi hunters. His message was simple in its structure and devastating in its implications. The Jedi were coming to exterminate them all. Individual resistance was futile, but together, if they gathered on Nathema, they could perform a ritual that would unleash the full power of the dark side and destroy their enemies forever. "Come to me," he said, "and we will show the galaxy what the Sith truly are." 8,000 Sith Lords answered his call. They came from every corner of the shattered empire. Beings who had commanded fleets and ruled star systems, who carried the accumulated knowledge of the dark side in their bones and in their holocrons, who represented the surviving peak of Sith Force ability after a war that had killed everyone less capable than them. They landed on Nathema, believing they were attending the most important moment in the history of their order. They were right about that part, at least. Vitiate welcomed them with ceremony. He spoke of unity and revenge. He told them they were about to witness the true power of the dark side. The assembled Sith Lords prepared themselves for something unprecedented. They had no way of knowing that the unprecedented thing they were about to witness was their own deaths, deliberately engineered by the man standing in front of them. When the ritual began, everything changed in an instant. Vitiate dropped every pretense and revealed what he actually was. The force poured from him like something that had been held under pressure for a very long time, and finally found its release. He hit 8,000 Sith Lords simultaneously, not in sequence, not in groups. All of them at once, in a single wave of force dominance so complete and so overwhelming that there was no coordinated resistance, because there was no gap between the moment it began and the moment every single one of them had already lost. Their wills shattered. They became unwilling participants in a ritual they had been told would save them. For 10 days, Nathema became something that defied description in conventional terms. Dark energy swirled through the atmosphere. The ritual consumed everything living on the planet. Not just the Sith Lords who had come there as victims, but the plants, the animals, every microorganism in the soil and air and water, the life force of an entire world. And 8,000 of the most powerful dark side users in history along with it flowed into Vitiate the way water flows into a drain. Thousands of years of accumulated power, knowledge, experience, and force ability merged with what he already was. When it ended, Nathema was silent. Not the silence of an uninhabited place, but the silence of a place from which something essential had been permanently removed. The force was gone from that world, not weakened, not diminished, removed. The way you might remove a piece from a structure, leaving behind a hole where something had been. The planet was not simply lifeless. It was a void, a wound in the force that any sensitive being who came near could feel as a kind of wrongness, a place where the galaxy's essential energy simply was not. Only one being survived, and he was no longer anything that could be described in the same terms as the Sith Lords he had destroyed. The ocean of life energy he had absorbed transformed him in ways that even the ritual's extraordinary power could not have guaranteed in advance. He had achieved what every Sith Lord throughout history had dreamed of, and none had managed. True immortality, not a near approximation, not an extended lifespan, not a technique for delaying death while it continued to approach. Actual, verifiable, essentially permanent continuation of existence, no longer vulnerable to the normal processes by which living beings eventually stop living. Beyond that, the power he now possessed dwarfed anything the galaxy had seen in the mortal era since the fall of the Celestials. The being who rose from the ruins of Nathema did not call himself Vitiate anymore. He had a simpler title now, one that needed no other words around it to convey what it meant. He called himself the Emperor. He spread a lie about what had happened on Nathema. He told the galaxy that the Jedi had done this, that they had destroyed the planet in their fanatical pursuit of Sith extinction. The hatred that lie generated would fuel his followers for centuries. And then he gathered the few Sith loyalists who had not attended his ritual, the ones who had not answered his call for one reason or another and therefore still lived. And he led them into the unknown regions. He already knew exactly where he was going. The journey took 20 years, which he used to plan with the particular patience of a being for whom time was no longer a constraint. He was not on a schedule. He was not racing against any deadline. He could afford to take 20 years to cross the galaxy because he had an essentially unlimited supply of time and a goal that required getting everything exactly right. By roughly 5,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, His people had established themselves on a world called Dromund Kaas. They built a new empire there, in absolute secrecy, isolated from the Republic that believed the Sith threat had been eliminated forever. And the Emperor began to build something that no Sith before him had ever truly had. An instrument calibrated not for the next decade or the next century, but for the next several thousand years. Unlike every previous Sith ruler, who had been constrained by the fact that they were going to die eventually, and therefore had to see their plans through within a finite window of time, the Emperor could design operations that would unfold over millennia. He did not need to compromise on timing. He did not need to accelerate any phase of his strategy because his own mortality was pressing against the schedule. He was the schedule. He was the one constant in every plan he made. And the plans he made were therefore of a scope that had simply never been attempted before. He embedded himself into every layer of his empire. He took on Sith apprentices, but not in any conventional sense. He created the Emperor's wrath, personal enforcers, whose wills he bent to his own. He took body after body as vessels for splinters of his consciousness, so that if any single form was ever threatened or destroyed, the essential continuity of his existence would persist somewhere else. He was not simply a ruler with a physical body and a political position. He was a distributed consciousness sustained by dark side power, inhabiting multiple hosts simultaneously, maintaining his core self across all of them, while each individual vessel lived out whatever role he needed it to play. This is where his power begins to differentiate itself from everything else in the mortal Sith tradition, and why he belongs in this conversation at all. Darth Vitiate, the Sith Emperor, did not simply possess greater force power than his contemporaries. He had fundamentally changed the relationship between a living being and the Force in a way that had not been achieved since the Age of the Ones. He was not a Jedi or a Sith in any normal sense of those terms anymore. He was something closer to what Abeloth had been, a consciousness so thoroughly merged with the dark side of the Force that the boundaries between himself and the energy field had become genuinely blurry. His immortality was not a technique he applied. It was his nature. His power was not something he drew on from an external source. It was what he was. The Republic had no idea he existed. The Jedi, who prided themselves on their sensitivity to disturbances in the Force, did not detect the growing shadow of an immortal Sith Emperor rebuilding his civilization in the unknown regions, preparing a war that had been designed to span 1,000 years. For 3 centuries, the Emperor's new empire grew in complete secrecy, hardening itself, training generations of soldiers and Sith warriors, building fleets whose numbers the Republic could not have imagined, all under the direction of a being who had eaten an entire world and 8,000 of the greatest dark side users who had ever lived, and had taken every ounce of their power into himself. 3 centuries is a long time to wait. For most beings, it is many lifetimes. For the Emperor, it was simply part of the plan. When he finally made his move, the galaxy did not see it coming. The Great Galactic War began around 3,680 years before the Battle of Yavin, and it shocked the Republic in a way that nothing had in living memory. The empire that emerged from the unknown regions was not a remnant. It was not a desperate last gesture from a broken order. It was a fully realized military and political civilization that matched the Republic in almost every dimension of power and exceeded it in several. The armies of Sith warriors who rode that initial wave of conquest had been training for generations under the direction of an immortal mastermind who had never stopped planning, never stopped refining, never lost focus for even one of the 3 centuries he had spent waiting. The war lasted for nearly 3 decades. Coruscant itself was sacked, which had not happened in living memory, and sent a psychological shockwave through the Republic that took generations to fully process. The Jedi Temple was destroyed. The political humiliation of the Treaty of Coruscant, which ended open hostilities in a way that heavily favored the Empire, left the Republic diminished and shaken in ways that went far beyond the strategic losses involved. Throughout all of it, the Emperor had been the architect, not the general on the battlefield, not the Sith Lord fighting other Sith Lords for position within the Imperial hierarchy. The architect, the unseen hand behind everything, manipulating events across a timeline so long that the beings living through those events could not perceive its shape. He had engineered the Mandalorian Wars before the Great Galactic War even began, using the Mandalorian threat to weaken the Republic and fracture the Jedi Order, drawing the most powerful Jedi of that generation into experiences that would make them more useful to his purposes. He had orchestrated the conditions under which Revan and Malak would discover his existence, and he had allowed that discovery to happen on his timetable, in a way that served his agenda rather than theirs. And through all of it, he remained functionally unkillable by any means available to his enemies. This is the point at which we need to talk honestly about what made Vitiate different from every other powerful Force user in the Sith tradition, and why that difference matters so much when we are measuring him against the other names on this list. Every Sith Lord before him had died. That is not an observation about failure or weakness. It is a structural fact about what the Sith were. Even the greatest among them, even the ones who came closer than anyone to achieving what Vitiate actually achieved, had eventually been brought down by something: age, betrayal, opponents who were strong enough or creative enough to find the gap in their defenses, the rule of 2. The philosophy that had governed the Sith for 1,000 years by Vitiate's time was built around this reality, the reality that masters die and apprentices succeed them, and the succession is the point. Vitiate had stepped outside that reality entirely. He was not subject to succession. He was not subject to the progression of one Sith Lord to the next. He was the ongoing constant beneath all of it, the foundation that persisted regardless of who rose or fell in the wider galaxy's political drama. When enemies managed to destroy one of his host bodies, his consciousness simply retreated to another and continued. He lost physical forms the way other beings lose hair. It was an inconvenience, not a threat. The first time his enemies came genuinely close to ending him, it required the specific combination of the most gifted Jedi of an entire generation, working together, catching him in a moment of unusual vulnerability. And even then, they did not fully succeed. They wounded him. They drove him into a state of reduced power. They forced him to retreat and consolidate and recover over an extended period. But they did not end him. And when he recovered, he proved it by consuming an entire second planet, Ziost, devouring all life on it, exactly as he had done on Nathema thousands of years earlier, restoring his power to its full level in a single apocalyptic act. 2 worlds consumed, tens of billions of lives devoured. The Force itself, permanently excised from 2 planets that now exist as voids in the galaxy's energy field, wounds that will never heal. This is the scale at which Vitiate operated, not the scale of a battle or a war or even an era of history, the scale of geological and spiritual events that permanently alter the nature of a place. And he came very close to doing it again not to a second world or a third, to the entire galaxy. His ultimate goal, the project he had been planning since before the Republic even knew he existed, was a ritual that would consume all life in the galaxy simultaneously. Every living being, from the largest to the smallest, every mind and body and force signature across every inhabited world, all of it flowing into him in one final act of consumption that would make him not simply the most powerful being in existence, but the only being in existence. This was not an exaggeration or a metaphor. It was a literal, carefully designed plan that he worked toward for over 1,000 years. That he ultimately failed is important. That he came as close as he did is equally important. Because the distance between what Vitiate achieved and the outcome he pursued is a measure of his power in a way that nothing else quite captures. He was not simply powerful enough to threaten planets. He was powerful enough to threaten the entire concept of life in the galaxy. And he pursued that threat with the patience and the resources of someone for whom time was essentially infinite and death was essentially optional. He is not the answer to our question, but he is the closest any being born mortal ever came to it. And the story of how he came even closer and of who ultimately stopped him is part of where we need to go next. There is one more name in the mortal tradition of the Force that has to be addressed before we can bring any of these threads together. A name that appears over and over in the records of this era. A name connected to both the Emperor's schemes and the eventual fate of the Republic and the Jedi. A being who was not born immortal, did not consume worlds, did not start as a god and fall into corruption. A being who started as a student became a warrior, became a conqueror, became a villain, became something harder to categorize than any of those labels, and whose power at every phase of that transformation was of a quality that made everyone who encountered it take the matter seriously. A being who, by the judgment of people who had met Sith emperors and Force gods, and every kind of dark side power the galaxy had produced, was still considered something genuinely extraordinary. His name was Revan, and his story is where this conversation begins to move from the cosmic to the personal, from the scale of gods and consuming rituals to the scale of one individual being who somehow managed to exist at the intersection of every major force of power in this entire era and walk out the other side still standing. The beginning of Revan's story is, on the surface, a familiar one. A gifted student, an order that recognized his potential, training that developed his abilities faster than almost anyone could match. Even in his early years, before anyone was quite sure what to make of him, the records describe a quality in his connection to the Force that set him apart from his peers in a way that was difficult to articulate but impossible to ignore. Masters who trained alongside him or observed his progress used language that kept returning to the same themes. Intuition, depth, the sense that he was not simply learning to use the Force, but engaging with it on a level that most Jedi took decades to approach, if they ever reached it at all. He was not the most powerful student in absolute terms. There were others with higher raw midichlorian counts, others whose specific abilities in narrow areas exceeded what he demonstrated. But power in the Force is not simply a matter of measurement. The Jedi understood this, even if they did not always find it easy to explain. Revan's strength was not in any single ability. It was in his complete fluency with the Force as a whole. His capacity to apply it across every discipline simultaneously. his instinct for exactly the right use of exactly the right technique in any given moment. He was not a master of one thing. He was a master of everything. And the combination of those masteries into a single coherent practice produced something that exceeded what any individual component would have suggested. By the time he had reached the level of Jedi Knight, people across the Order were already beginning to use a word about him that the Jedi were normally cautious about applying to any living being: prodigy. Not in the casual sense of someone who learns quickly, in the more precise sense of someone in whom the Force itself seems to have taken an unusual interest. The Mandalorian Wars changed him. They were supposed to. That was, in a sense, the point. The Mandalorian Wars were not what anyone who fought in them believed they were. That is the central tragedy of Revan's story. And it is the thing that separates him from every other powerful Force user who came before or after him. He did not simply fall to the dark side through weakness or ambition or the slow erosion of his principles under the pressure of difficult choices. He was manipulated, specifically, precisely, patiently manipulated by the most powerful mortal intelligence the Sith tradition had ever produced, who engineered the entire conflict for the express purpose of creating exactly the kind of being Revan became. The Emperor had watched the Republic and the Jedi Order for centuries and understood something that neither institution understood about itself. The Jedi of that era were capable and principled, but they were also insular, cautious to the point of paralysis, and deeply reluctant to allow their most powerful members to develop in any direction that the Council had not pre-approved. A Jedi who trained normally, who went through the traditional progression of Padawan and Knight, and perhaps eventually Master, would be formidable. But a Jedi who was forced to survive a 16-year war, who had to make decisions that cost thousands of lives and still keep going, who had to face the actual limits of what the light side could accomplish against an enemy that did not share its restraints. That Jedi would be something else entirely, more dangerous, more complete, and, if pushed far enough into darkness, potentially convertible into the most powerful instrument of Sith power the galaxy had seen since the Nathema ritual. This was the plan. Not a plan that took a decade or even a century to unfold. A plan that stretched across the entire span of the Emperor's hidden reign, waiting for the moment when the Republic's defenders were exactly vulnerable enough and exactly powerful enough to serve as the raw material for what he needed. Revan walked into it. He could not have known. The hints were there, scattered across battlefields and in dying words, but none of them cohered into a clear picture until it was already too late. He fought the Mandalorians with everything he had. He became the general that the Republic needed, the one the Jedi Council had refused to be, and he won. He ended the war at Malachor V with a weapon so devastating that it shattered a planet and broke an entire warrior culture in a single moment of terrible, calculated violence. And then Mandalore the Ultimate died at his feet and told him the truth. A red-skinned Sith had manipulated the entire conflict from the beginning. The Mandalorians had been a tool. The war had been a game. And the game's architect was still out there. Revan took that information and did what Revan always did. He went toward the threat rather than away from it. He took Malak and a fleet of loyal soldiers and Jedi into the unknown regions, hunting for the hidden enemy that Mandalore's dying confession had revealed. The Republic assumed they were pursuing scattered Mandalorian forces. They had no idea that the two most powerful Jedi of their generation were walking directly into the most carefully constructed trap in Sith history. When Revan and Malak found the Sith Empire on Dromund Kaas and stood in the Emperor's throne room, they were already fighting at a disadvantage that no amount of Force ability could fully compensate for. The Emperor had been alive for over 1,000 years. He had consumed an entire world's worth of Force-sensitive life, and 8,000 Sith Lords on top of that. His command of Force domination operated at a scale that simply had no parallel in anything Revan or Malak had ever encountered. He broke their wills, not over days or weeks through torture and attrition, the way other dark side users might have attempted it. He shattered their resistance almost immediately with a mental assault so overwhelming and so complete that they had no framework for fighting it. They walked in as Jedi heroes trying to find and neutralize a threat to the Republic. They walked out as Sith Lords carrying the Emperor's agenda back into known space. There is something important to understand about what happened in that throne room. Something beyond the obvious catastrophe of two powerful Jedi being broken and turned. The Emperor was, by any reasonable measure, a being of incomparably greater raw power than Revan or Malak. He had spent over 1,000 years accumulating Force energy and refining its application. He had consumed a world. He had developed techniques of mental domination that operated on a civilizational scale, not just the individual mind tricks that most Force users understood, but a sustained architectural control of entire populations that he had been practicing and improving since before the Republic even knew he existed. Against that, the Force ability of two Jedi, however exceptional, was always going to be insufficient for a direct contest. What made it significant is that Revan resisted as long as he did. The records are not specific about the duration of the mental assault before his will finally broke, but they suggest it was not instantaneous. It took effort, real effort, from the most powerful mortal Force-sensitive being in the history of the galaxy to break Revan. That detail matters. It tells you something about the quality of what Revan had that is not captured by any standard measurement. But here is where Revan's story diverges from every other cautionary tale about a Jedi who fell to darkness. He was too strong for the Emperor's control to hold permanently. As weeks became months and months became years, something in him began to surface. The same quality that had made him exceptional as a Jedi. The depth and completeness of his connection to the Force meant that the Emperor's mental conditioning could not fully overwrite who he was. It eroded, slowly, partially, not in any way that restored him cleanly to what he had been before Dromund Kaas, but enough to give him room to think his own thoughts. He was no longer trying to prepare the Republic for the Emperor's invasion. He was doing something else. He was building the power and the infrastructure that would be needed to stop it. That shift was subtle enough that Malak did not detect it for a long time. The Jedi Civil War that Revan launched on his return to Republic space was devastating in its impact, destructive in a way that cost billions of lives and nearly ended both the Jedi Order and the Republic as functioning institutions. But throughout all of it, Revan was making choices that did not quite fit the profile of a Sith Lord committed to conquest. He preserved industrial infrastructure rather than destroying it. He integrated conquered worlds rather than stripping them. He built an empire that was designed to function, not simply to dominate. Sith scholars, looking back at the Jedi Civil War, have argued for centuries about what Revan was actually trying to do, and the most compelling answer, supported by what he said in moments of unusual candor, is that he was building a weapon. A weapon aimed not at the Republic, but at the Emperor who had sent him there. Whether the plan would have worked will never be known. Malak's betrayal ended it before it could be tested. The moment the Jedi strike team boarded his flagship, Malak opened fire on his own master's bridge, trying to kill Revan and claim sole control of the Sith Empire they had built together. It was the most quintessentially Sith act in the entire conflict. An apprentice deciding the moment was right and striking. Revan was critically wounded. Bastila Shan found him dying on his own bridge. And instead of finishing what Malak had started, she saved him and brought him to the Jedi Council. What the Council chose to do next is one of the most morally complex decisions in the entire history of the Jedi Order. They wiped his mind. They erased everything he was and replaced it with a constructed identity. A Republic soldier with no memory of being Revan, no access to the knowledge of the Sith Empire he had built, no connection to the dark side corruption that had developed over years of war. Then they sent him back into the galaxy with Bastila as his handler, intending to use the Force bond between them to guide him toward the information they needed about the Starforge. What they got instead was something they had not anticipated, though perhaps they should have. Even without his memories, even with his identity replaced by something artificial, the being who walked through the world as this anonymous Republic soldier demonstrated Force abilities and intuitive strategic intelligence that made everyone around him take the matter seriously. He was not performing at the level of Darth Revan. He was not tapping into the accumulated knowledge and power of everything that had made him what he was. But even the version of him that had no past still had something that most Force users never develop: a natural fluency with the Force that operated below the level of conscious technique, a way of being in the energy field rather than drawing on it. The memories came back, not all at once and not cleanly, but in fragments that reassembled themselves into something that gave him back enough of what he had been to matter. He defeated Malak at the Starforge. He redeemed Bastila from the dark side corruption Malak had subjected her to. He ended the Jedi Civil War and was hailed as the Republic's savior for the second time in his life, which is a distinction nobody else in history has managed even once. But the story was not finished. The memory wipe had not erased the most important thing Revan had carried back from Dromund Kaas: the knowledge that the Emperor existed, that he was still out there, that the Jedi Civil War had been a distraction within a much longer strategy, and that the Republic had no idea what was actually waiting for it. Revan began to remember the Emperor in pieces, in nightmares and flashes that surfaced, despite what the Council had done to his mind. He assembled those pieces into a picture that terrified him. He chose not to tell the Council. He had learned, by that point, that the Council's response to information they could not contextualize was to do exactly the wrong thing with it. He went back to find the Emperor alone. He was intercepted, captured, and imprisoned on Dromund Kaas for 300 years. 300 years. The number is almost impossible to hold as a meaningful concept. Most galactic civilizations do not persist unchanged for 3 centuries. Most institutions, philosophies, and power structures in the galaxy cycle through multiple iterations in that span of time. Revan sat in the Emperor's captivity, kept alive by Sith techniques designed to extract information and sustain a prisoner indefinitely. while the galaxy he had fought to protect continued without him. He did not simply endure. He fought, not with lightsabers or force abilities in any conventional sense, but with the same tool he had always wielded most effectively: his mind. He spent every one of those 300 years pushing back against the Emperor's attempts to break him. And more significantly, he spent them influencing the Emperor through their sustained proximity. The Emperor had kept him alive as a trophy and a source of strategic insight. What he had not fully accounted for was that a mind as formidable as Revan's does not stop working simply because it is imprisoned. It adapts. It finds the available levers and applies pressure to them continuously, with the patience of someone who has understood from the beginning that this was going to take a very long time. Revan's sustained resistance contributed, according to later Jedi analysis, to a measurable slowing of the Emperor's plans. The invasion the Emperor had been building toward for centuries kept being delayed, readjusted, postponed. The reasons for these delays were never entirely clear from the outside, but the internal records of the Sith Empire suggest that the Emperor himself was the source of the hesitation, returning repeatedly to the project of breaking Revan completely before moving forward, and finding that the project never quite reached completion, no matter how many centuries he applied to it. When Revan was finally freed by a Republic strike team, the story did not resolve cleanly. The version of him that emerged from captivity was not the Revan who had walked in. 300 years of Sith techniques and isolation, and the Emperor's sustained mental pressure had done things to him that could not be undone simply by being rescued. He took control of an ancient factory called the Foundry and began building an army of droids programmed to kill every member of the Sith Empire. Every soldier, every civilian, every person associated with the Imperial cause. The plan had the strategic elegance of something designed by the same mind that had ended the Mandalorian Wars at Malachor V, but it also had the moral character of someone who had been in the dark for too long and had come out the other side of something that had fundamentally altered his relationship to the question of acceptable costs. Imperial forces stopped him before the Foundry could complete its work. His physical form was destroyed, but what happened next is one of the stranger and more remarkable events in Legend's history. His essence split. The light side of his spirit became one with the Force, dispersing in the way that powerful Jedi sometimes do at the moment of death, present, but no longer individual. The dark side of him maintained a separate existence, driven by a singular obsession, completing the destruction of the Emperor that he had been working toward across 3 centuries. That fragment persisted, exerted influence, guided events, from the threshold between existence and non-existence. Eventually, both halves merged on Yavin 4, and what remained was neither the Jedi hero of the Mandalorian Wars nor the dark obsession of the Foundry, but something complete, a being who had been through every possible extreme the Force could offer and had arrived, finally, at a kind of peace that cost everything but left something whole. The mask was what remained, and the lightsaber, and the memory, carried forward in the beings who had encountered him and the events that his long arc through history had shaped. Revan's case for the most powerful mortal Force user in history rests on a different kind of argument than raw destructive capability. It rests on range. No other being in the Legends tradition demonstrated mastery of both sides of the Force at the level Revan achieved, in both the theoretical and the practical sense. No other being influenced events across such a sustained span of time, first as a living actor and then as something harder to categorize, no other being resisted the Emperor for 3 centuries without being broken, which by itself says something significant about the quality of his will and his connection to the Force. He was not simply powerful, he was the most complete Force user the mortal galaxy produced. But complete is not the same as strongest. And to understand where the conversation goes from here, we need to move forward several thousand years, to a lineage of Sith whose approach to power was almost the opposite of Vitiate's, not consuming everything around them to fuel their own existence, but refining themselves through a discipline that bordered on the scientific. The Rule of Two changed everything about what the Sith were and what they could become. Before Darth Bane, the Sith operated as an institution. They had academies, hierarchies, competing factions, political structures. The natural consequence of all that organizational complexity was that the actual quality of Force ability across any given generation of Sith was diluted by the sheer number of practitioners. Power is not infinitely divisible. When you have 1,000 Sith Lords, most of them are mediocre. The few exceptional ones spend most of their energy navigating the political landscape of their institution, rather than developing what makes them genuinely dangerous. Bane understood this with a clarity that his contemporaries could not match. He looked at the Sith Brotherhood of Darkness at the Battle of Ruusan and saw not an army at the height of its power, but a system in terminal decline, producing increasingly ordinary dark side users who would never develop into anything genuinely threatening to the Jedi because they were too busy fighting each other to become what they could have been. He destroyed that institution. He used the thought bomb to end it, drawing every dark side user present into a single catastrophic Force technique that killed them all, himself surviving by stepping outside the radius at the last moment. Then he rebuilt the Sith from scratch, on a completely different architectural principle. 2, only ever 2, a master to embody the full accumulated power and knowledge of the tradition, and an apprentice to absorb everything the master knew, while simultaneously developing the drive and the capability to eventually surpass them. Each generation would be stronger than the last, because each master trained their apprentice in everything, held nothing back, and then the apprentice was tested in the most extreme possible way, by having to kill their master to take the mantle. The ones who succeeded were genuinely exceptional. The ones who were not were eliminated before they could dilute the lineage. The Rule of Two ran for 1,000 years. 1,000 years of each generation surpassing the last of the accumulated dark side knowledge of every master being passed forward intact to an apprentice who would then add their own discoveries before passing it all forward again. The compounding effect of that process across 30 or 40 generations is staggering to consider. By the time the lineage reached its final iteration, what Bane had designed was producing the most refined dark side practitioners in the history of the Sith tradition, precisely because his system had been eliminating every practitioner who was not good enough for a millennium before that final iteration arrived. Consider what this actually means in concrete terms. Each Sith master who trained an apprentice under the Rule of Two did not simply teach techniques and philosophy. They handed over everything. Every Force secret they had discovered, every dark side application they had developed or inherited, every tactical and strategic insight they had gathered. And then the apprentice who succeeded them carried all of that forward, added to it through their own decades of development, and eventually handed the complete accumulated package to the next generation. It is the most efficient system for concentrating and compounding esoteric knowledge that the Legends tradition describes, and it ran for 10 centuries without interruption. The second to last link in that chain was a moon scientist named Hego Damask. The galaxy knew him by his public identity, a prominent figure in the intergalactic banking clan. The Sith knew him as Darth Plagueis, and the specific quality that made Plagueis extraordinary was not his combat ability, which was considerable but not the point, or his political acumen, which was genuine but secondary. It was his relationship with the Force itself, which he had chosen to approach the way a scientist approaches a problem rather than the way a warrior approaches an opponent. Plagueis believed that the Force was not merely an energy field to be drawn on, but a system to be understood at its most fundamental level. The mechanism through which living beings connected to that system was the midi-chlorian, and the midi-chlorian was, he concluded, not simply a biological marker of Force sensitivity, but an active participant in the Force's expression through living matter. If you could understand midi-chlorians precisely enough, you could understand the Force at the level where it actually operated. And if you could understand it at that level, you could do things that every previous Force user had simply accepted as impossible. His experiments were extensive and, by any conventional ethical standard, deeply troubling. He worked on living subjects, pushing the boundaries between life and death repeatedly in the same individuals, learning from each iteration what the Force would and would not permit under various conditions. He discovered that with sufficient mastery of midi-chlorian manipulation, a Force user could prevent the death of a living being from injuries and conditions that should have been fatal. Not healing in the conventional medical sense, not even healing in the Force-enhanced medical sense that Jedi healers practiced, but something closer to a direct renegotiation of the terms by which a body determined whether to continue functioning. He pushed this further. If the Force could be directed through midi-chlorians to sustain life against odds that should have ended it, what were the actual limits of that direction? He began to theorize that a sufficiently precise manipulation of midi-chlorians might be able to do something that no mortal being had managed outside of the Sith tradition of spirit preservation, achieve true biological continuity, not by storing consciousness in a holocron or a Force ghost or a series of host bodies, but by simply preventing the cellular processes that constitute aging and death from completing their normal progression. He came close. The records suggest he came genuinely, measurably close. He achieved things with midi-chlorian manipulation that his colleagues in both the Jedi and Sith traditions had considered theoretical impossibilities. He kept subjects alive through conditions that should have killed them. He influenced the Force at the level where it interfaced with biological matter in ways that no one before him had understood well enough to attempt. And then his apprentice killed him in his sleep. Darth Sidious had been watching everything Plagueis discovered, absorbing every breakthrough, cataloging every technique, and filing it away in a mind that was assessing not the value of the knowledge for its own sake, but the value of it as a tool for a specific purpose. That purpose was not immortality, though Sidious understood the appeal. That purpose was not even the completion of the Sith Grand Plan in any abstract sense. That purpose was total, absolute, permanent control of the galaxy, with himself as its sole sovereign. Everything else, including the Master who had given him every technique he needed to pursue that purpose, was expendable once its usefulness had been extracted. Plagueis died, never knowing that his greatest discovery may have been made on his behalf rather than his own. The evidence that his experiments with midi-chlorian manipulation had, somewhere in their long progress, produced a consequence he had not fully accounted for. A child born on Tatooine without a father. a slave boy with a midi-chlorian count higher than any recorded measurement in Jedi history. A being whose potential in the Force was not simply greater than any existing practitioner, but of a different order entirely. As though the Force itself had responded to Plagueis's interference in its mechanisms by producing the one being most capable of restoring whatever balance his tampering had disturbed. Anakin Skywalker's midi-chlorian count exceeded 20,000 per cell. Yoda's, the highest among the Jedi, was a fraction of that. The Jedi who measured it could not fully process what the number implied. They understood that more midi-chlorians meant greater Force sensitivity, a stronger and more direct connection to the energy field. What 20,000 per cell meant in practical terms, for a being with proper training and proper support, was not something any of them had a reference point for, because nothing with that count had ever existed before. This is where Anakin's case for the most powerful Force user enters the conversation, and it is a more complicated case than it looks on the surface. Because Anakin never fully became what his potential implied he could be. He was too old when training began, carrying emotional attachments that the Jedi system was not designed to work with rather than trying to eliminate them. He was trained by a master who loved him genuinely, but who was not equipped to be what Anakin actually needed. Someone who could have met him at the level his power demanded, rather than trying to fit him into the existing structure. The trauma of his mother's death, the secret marriage, the nightmares about Padme, the sustained anxiety of being the most important being in the galaxy for people who could not tell him why. All of it created conditions in which his extraordinary potential was never fully expressed in any direction. When he fell to the dark side and became Darth Vader, he gained access to the emotional fuel that the dark side runs on. But he lost something at the same time. The injuries from Mustafar were irreversible. The suit that kept him alive also limited the precise connection to the Force that very high-level technique requires. Estimates from legend scholars suggest that Vader, at his most powerful, operated at perhaps 60% of what Anakin Skywalker had the potential to become. 60% of that potential was still terrifying, still sufficient to dominate virtually every other Force-sensitive being the galaxy produced in that era. But the ceiling of what he could have been remained unachieved. The moment that comes closest to expressing what Anakin might have been, if everything had been different, is the moment on the second Death Star when he threw Palpatine into the reactor shaft, not because of the Force abilities involved, which were not particularly elaborate in technical terms, but because of what powered it. The Force, in that moment, flowed through him not as dark side rage or light side serenity, but as something more fundamental than either. A father's love for his son, expressed through the most decisive physical act of his life, strong enough to override 2 decades of conditioning and injury, and the Emperor's sustained psychological grip. The Force responded to that. The Chosen One prophecy was fulfilled in that moment, and the fulfillment felt like the universe itself exhaling after holding its breath for a very long time. What Anakin represents in this conversation is potential rather than achievement. The highest recorded potential for Force connection in the history of mortal beings. Had that potential been fully developed, had all the circumstances of his life been different in the ways that would have allowed the Force flowing through him to be properly expressed, it is genuinely uncertain what the upper limit of his power would have been. Some legend scholars have argued that a fully realized Anakin Skywalker, trained from infancy with the emotional stability his actual training never allowed him, might have approached the raw force output of the sun himself, the dark side personified. That argument is speculative, but it is not dismissed easily by anyone who takes the implications of his midi-chlorian count seriously. Darth Sidious was not a being of speculative potential. He was a being of achieved power, and the distinction matters enormously in any honest comparison. He began studying the dark side under Plagueis at roughly 19 years old. After demonstrating a natural affinity for force sensitivity that his master recognized as something exceptional, even before formal training began. Over the next several decades, he absorbed everything the Rule of Two's accumulated millennium of dark side knowledge had to offer. Plagueis, unusual among Sith masters in this respect, shared his discoveries openly, rather than holding crucial knowledge back as insurance against betrayal. This meant Sidious inherited not just the standard curriculum of the Sith tradition, but also Plagueis's unique research into midi-chlorian manipulation, his experiments in sustaining life against its natural arc, his theoretical work on the intersection of force ability and biological process. All of it went into a mind that was simultaneously assembling one of the most sophisticated political careers in the history of the Republic. The combination is what made Palpatine singular. Every other Sith Lord in the tradition had been, at core, a warrior with political ambitions. Even the most strategically sophisticated among them, even Vitiate himself, had used politics as a tool of military power. Sidious was something genuinely different. A political genius of the First Order who also happened to be among the most powerful dark side force users alive. He did not need the dark side to win in the Senate chamber. He was winning there through entirely conventional human intelligence and carefully constructed persona. The dark side was what he brought to everything the Senate chamber could not contain. By the time he revealed himself as Emperor, Palpatine had been operating in the highest levels of galactic politics for decades, while simultaneously developing his dark side abilities to a level that had not been reached since the early Sith Empire. He had absorbed everything Plagueis could teach him. He had added to it through his own research and practice across a career spanning the better part of a century. He had refined, from Bane's lineage, the accumulated wisdom and technique of 1,000 years of the most rigorous force development program the Sith had ever run. The results were demonstrated in ways that left very little room for interpretation. When Mace Windu, arguably the finest combat duelist the Jedi Order had produced in a generation, came to arrest him with 3 other Council Masters, 2 things happened. The first was that Palpatine killed 3 of those 4 Council Masters before they could meaningfully engage, with a speed and ferocity that left no time for the kind of coordinated response that even highly trained Jedi could have mounted. The second was that his duel with Windu himself, the one Jedi present who came closest to matching him, was close enough and sustained enough that it required Anakin's interference to resolve. Whether Palpatine was genuinely losing that fight or manufacturing the situation to maximize the psychological impact of what he knew Anakin would do when he saw it is a question the records do not definitively answer. Both interpretations have serious arguments behind them. What is not in question is the scale of his Force lightning, which operated at a level that was lethal not merely to the individuals it struck, but to the environment around them. It is not in question that he drove Yoda, the Grand Master of the Jedi Order and the most respected Force practitioner of his age, to a draw before Yoda withdrew from the confrontation. It is not in question that he sustained an empire for over 2 decades through a combination of Force-enhanced manipulation, institutional domination, and the careful management of every significant Force-sensitive individual in the galaxy, eliminating those who represented threats and corrupting those who might be useful. He also spent those 2 decades developing techniques that went beyond anything the Sith tradition's standard curriculum had included. Force storms of a scale that could destroy fleets, essence transfer, the ability to move his consciousness between bodies, which he had apparently refined to a functional level by the time of his apparent death at Endor. The evidence for this comes from what happened afterward. In Legends, he returned, in cloned bodies, several times. Each return demonstrated that the techniques he had developed for preserving and transferring his consciousness worked, that he had solved a version of the immortality problem that Plagueis had approached from the biological direction by pursuing it from the spiritual one instead. He is not the most powerful, but his case for being the most practically dangerous, the most completely realized, the most fully expressed instance of Sith power in the era of the Rule of Two, is the strongest of anyone in that tradition. Then there is Yoda. Yoda's power is the most consistently underestimated in any discussion like this one, partly because of how he presents himself, and partly because of what he chooses to do with what he has. He spent 900 years developing his connection to the Force with a patience and a depth that no other being in the Jedi tradition matched in the era leading up to the Clone Wars. By the time he was the Grand Master of the Order, he had been practicing for longer than most Sith dynasties lasted. His midi-chlorian count was the highest of any known Jedi. His combat abilities, despite what his appearance suggested, were sufficient to give Palpatine a genuine contest and to eliminate Count Dooku without particular difficulty. What those 900 years actually produced in terms of Force understanding is easy to undervalue, because Yoda's manner of expressing it was never theatrical. He did not make grand demonstrations. He did not generate the kind of visible, overwhelming Force output that beings like Vitiate or Palpatine favored. His power expressed itself in a quality of presence rather than a quantity of force, in an awareness of what the Force was doing around him and through him that operated at a level of refinement that most beings never approach in a single lifetime, let alone 9 of them. The specific things he could do at his peak were genuinely extraordinary by any comparative standard. His telekinetic ability operated at ranges and with a precision that other practitioners found nearly impossible to match. His Force sense was so acute that he could perceive events across vast distances and through subtle impressions that would be invisible to most Force-sensitive beings. His combat reflexes, supplemented by Ataru's extremely demanding physical requirements, demonstrated a connection between Force awareness and physical response that could only be developed across the kind of sustained practice he had accumulated. And his knowledge of Force lore and ancient technique was the deepest of any living practitioner in his era, drawing on 9 centuries of active study and experience that no single human or shorter-lived species could have replicated. But the most interesting dimension of Yoda's Force capability is not his combat power or even his sheer longevity of practice. It is his eventual mastery of what Qui-Gon Jinn first began to discover at the end of his life: the technique of preserving consciousness in the Force after physical death. Yoda spent his years of exile on Dagobah, not merely waiting for Luke, but actively pursuing the next stage of what it meant to be a Force practitioner, guided by the spirit of Qui-Gon. He achieved something no one had managed before him in the Jedi tradition: the ability to retain identity, memory, and the capacity to interact with the living after death, not as a dark side spirit tethered to an anchor, but as a genuine extension of himself into the Force's continuity. The Force Ghost tradition that Yoda and Obi-Wan Kenobi established, and that eventually included Anakin Skywalker himself, represents a different axis of power than combat ability or destructive output. It is power over the boundary between existence and non-existence. The Sith had pursued immortality through consumption and domination and body hopping for thousands of years. The Jedi found something quieter and more complete: the ability to simply remain part of the living Force indefinitely, in a form that retained everything essential about who they were. Yoda's contribution to this tradition, and the 9 centuries of practice and wisdom that produced it, earn him a place near the top of the mortal tier of this conversation. Not at its peak, because his choice to work within limits, to be what the Force needed him to be, rather than everything he could theoretically become, means his power is always expressed through restraint rather than maximized output. But the restraint itself is a kind of mastery, and it should not be mistaken for limitation. Which brings us to Luke Skywalker. And here is where the Legends tradition does something remarkable. In the films, Luke is a hero, a great one, the son of the Chosen One, trained under Yoda and Obi-Wan, redeemer of his father. The person whose refusal to fight Vader on the second Death Star broke the Emperor's plan and fulfilled the prophecy. His power in the films is evident and impressive by any standard the films establish. But the films cover a specific window of time, and they do not show what Luke became afterward. Legends does. In the decades that followed the Battle of Endor, Luke rebuilt the Jedi Order from almost nothing. He trained a new generation of Force-sensitive individuals, developed new techniques, expanded the theoretical understanding of what the Force could do in directions that the old Jedi Order had never explored. The old Order had been a conservative institution in many respects, shaped by thousands of years of tradition that had calcified in ways that made it resistant to new understanding, even when that understanding might have served the Force better than the inherited doctrine. Luke had no such institution to inherit. He had ruins and fragments, and a small collection of individuals with varying degrees of Force sensitivity and widely varying backgrounds. What he built from those materials was something that reflected his own synthesis of everything he had experienced. Light and dark side, both, rather than a recreation of what had existed before. He also confronted threats that the old order had never faced, including beings and forces of nature that operated on scales the prequel-era Jedi would not have had frameworks to address. He confronted the resurrected Palpatine across multiple returned clones and defeated him again. He faced Exar Kun's spirit, which had been sustained for millennia in the ruins of Yavin 4's ancient Sith temples, and dissolved it. He helped coordinate the Jedi response to the Yuuzhan Vong, a species that existed outside the Force entirely, and whose invasion represented an existential threat to the galaxy, on a scale that had not been seen since the Sith Empire's assault on the Republic thousands of years earlier. That particular campaign cost the lives of people he loved and tested every aspect of his understanding of what the Force required from him. Through all of it, what grew in Luke was not simply greater raw ability, though his raw ability grew considerably with each decade. What grew was something more fundamental, a depth of understanding about the Force's actual nature that the old Jedi tradition had deliberately avoided, and the Sith tradition had been constitutionally incapable of reaching. He understood, in a way that gradually became the organizing principle of his teaching, that the Force was not two things in opposition but one thing expressing itself through two poles, and that the practitioners who tried to exist purely at one extreme were not accessing the full reality of what the Force was, but only a partial and distorted version of it. This understanding is what made the confrontation with Abeloth possible. He confronted the resurrected Palpatine. He faced Exar Kun's spirit and defeated it. He helped drive back the Yuuzhan Vong, a species that existed outside the Force entirely, and whose invasion represented an existential threat unlike anything since the Mandalorian Wars. And then, 44 years after Yavin, he faced Abeloth. The campaign against Abeloth is the most important data point for evaluating Luke Skywalker's power, because Abeloth, as established earlier in this conversation, operates at a tier that has no equivalent in the mortal Force tradition. She is not a powerful Sith Lord or a gifted Jedi who went bad. She is a being who forced the son and daughter of the Force to their knees with casual ease. She had survived tens of thousands of years of imprisonment. In a prison made of black holes, she had multiple bodies, multiple avatars, multiple simultaneous manifestations spread across different locations, and destroying one did not end her. Luke fought her, directly, repeatedly. He tracked her through the Maw, battled her avatars, and eventually, in the final confrontation at Sinkhole Station, and through the ancient space within the cluster of black holes, he and Darth Krayt together struck her down in a way that ended her active threat. He speculated afterward that she might not be permanently gone, that a being as ancient and as thoroughly merged with the Force as Abeloth might simply be beyond the reach of anything truly final. But the threat was ended. The cycle of her returns, which had been the most persistent and dangerous pattern in 100,000 years of galactic history, was broken. No Jedi or Sith in the entire history of the galaxy had ever done anything comparable to this. No mortal Force user before Luke had ever stood against Abeloth and walked away. The ancient records describe the ones fighting her, the Father and his divine children, the very embodiments of the Force's nature. And what Luke Skywalker accomplished is that, as a mortal being born of the Sith tradition's most elaborate and destructive scheme, and the Jedi tradition's deepest legacy, he managed to do what only the Force gods had done before. He also fulfilled what the Journal of the Whills called the prophecy of the Son of Suns. Born under Tatooine's twin suns, son of the Chosen One, carrying the light side's protective function in his own person, the way the daughter once had, and the father once had. The ancient prophecies had not been about Anakin specifically. They had been about a pattern, a recurring agent of balance that the Force would produce whenever the imbalance grew severe enough to require it. Anakin was one expression of that pattern. Luke was another, and Luke's expression of it was more complete than his father's because he had the time and the stability and, in the end, the wisdom to grow into everything his bloodline implied he could become. By the final years of his Legends arc, Luke Skywalker was operating at a level that had no clear precedent in the mortal Force tradition. His understanding of the Force encompassed both sides in a way that the old binary of Jedi and Sith had never allowed for. He taught his students to listen to the will of the Force rather than imposing their own frameworks on it, which is a subtler and more advanced practice than it sounds, because it requires first achieving enough mastery to distinguish the Force's actual current from your own projections of what it should be doing. He understood, in a way that Revan had glimpsed and the Father had always known, that balance was not a static condition, but a dynamic process, and that serving it required continuous attention rather than a one-time achievement. He became, the ancient records suggest, the closest thing the post-celestial galaxy had to a keeper of balance. Not the Father reborn, not the daughter returned, but a mortal human being who had walked every path the Force offered and arrived at a synthesis that those ancient divine figures might have recognized as something they would have approved of. Now the question that this entire journey has been building toward: who was the most powerful Force user in the history of the galaxy? It is worth pausing here to acknowledge what this question is actually asking, because the way you interpret it changes the answer. If you are asking who could generate the most raw, destructive Force output at their absolute peak, the answer is Abeloth, and it is not particularly close. If you are asking who had the highest measured potential for Force connection among mortal beings, the answer is Anakin Skywalker, and that answer is supported by the only quantitative measure the Legends tradition offers. If you are asking who demonstrated the most sustained and comprehensive practical dominance in Force ability across the longest span of time, the answer is the Sith Emperor Vitiate, who ruled effectively for over 1,500 years and consumed 2 planets in the process. If you are asking who produced the most refined and complete expression of what the Sith dark side tradition could achieve in a single practitioner, the answer is Darth Sidious. If you are asking who possessed the deepest single tradition mastery through the longest sustained practice in the Jedi Order, the answer is Yoda. Each of those is a legitimate version of the question. Each has a legitimate answer. The problem with the original question is that it treats power as a single dimension when it is actually several overlapping ones, and different beings excelled on different axes in ways that make direct comparison genuinely difficult, without first deciding what you are comparing. What this conversation has been building toward, however, is a slightly different version of the question. Not who could hit the hardest, or last the longest, or consume the most, but who had the most complete and meaningful relationship with the Force itself, the fullest expression of what it actually means to be a Force user at the highest level, understood not merely as a matter of output, but as a matter of depth and integration and purpose. We began with the Celestials, who were not Force users in the conventional sense, but Force-empowered architects whose work shaped the physical galaxy itself. We acknowledged them as context rather than contestants. We examined the ones who were not Force users at all, but Force itself given form and personality. The Father, the Son, and the Daughter are in a category so far beyond any other entity in this conversation that comparing them to Revan or Palpatine would be like comparing the ocean to a cup of water drawn from it. They are not the answer because they were never really part of the mortal contest this question implies. Abeloth is the closest thing to an answer that exists within the bounds of the Force tradition as a whole. She started mortal and became something that exceeded every other being in this conversation by such a significant margin that the gap is not really bridgeable through ordinary comparison. She forced divine entities to submit. She survived for tens of thousands of years in conditions designed to prevent her from ever being active again. She emerged from that imprisonment and immediately posed a threat that required one of the most accomplished Force users in mortal history, and an experienced Sith Lord working in concert to stop And even then, the question of whether she was truly ended or merely temporarily contained was left open. On any measure of raw force power, she is the answer. But the most powerful is not always the most meaningful. And if the question is not simply who could generate the most destructive output or the most fear, but who had the deepest and most complete relationship with the Force itself, then the answer becomes more complicated. Vitiate consumed everything around him and made himself effectively unkillable. But his relationship with the Force was one of taking rather than understanding. He was powerful because he had eaten power. He was not wise with it. He was not balanced in it. He was a repository of consumed Force energy, not a being who had understood what the Force was. Revan had the widest range of any mortal Force user in recorded history, and the most complete mastery of both sides. His case is strong, and it should not be dismissed. Anakin had the highest potential ever measured. What that potential fully realized might have looked like remains one of the great, unanswered questions of Legends. Palpatine had the most refined, practical expression of dark side power across the mortal tradition. Yoda had the deepest single tradition mastery and the wisest relationship with the Force of any being in his era. And Luke, in the end, did something none of them managed. He grew into the full scope of what the Skywalker lineage implied, and then used it to do what only gods had done before. If the question is, who sat closest to the Force's actual nature, who most fully became what the Force might have designed a mortal being to be in the era after the Ones withdrew and the Celestials vanished, the answer that the Legends tradition most consistently points toward is not a Sith Lord of any era. It is not the product of any ritual, or any consumption, or any technique designed to extract power from something external. It is a human being from Tatooine who went from staring at twin suns in a desert to standing at the center of the galaxy's oldest and deepest pattern, fulfilling a prophecy so ancient that the beings who wrote it were themselves long dead before the Jedi Order was founded. A being who faced the most extreme test the post-celestial galaxy had ever produced, and who, in facing it, demonstrated that the mortal Force tradition had finally arrived somewhere new. Not where the Ones had been, but pointed in the same direction. Luke Skywalker, born under twin suns, son of the sun, the most powerful Force user the mortal galaxy produced, not because he could move the most mass or generate the most lightning or absorb the most life force from those around him, but because he grew into a complete relationship with the Force that included its darkness without being consumed by it, served its light without being blinded by it, and faced its oldest and most terrifying expression in the history of the universe and did not break. The Force is not a weapon. It is not a tool. It is not a reservoir of power to be drained, or a system to be hacked, or a tradition to be refined across 1,000 years of increasingly lethal competition. It is the living energy that runs through everything and connects everything and seeks, always, to find its way back to balance. The most powerful Force user in history is the one who understood that most completely and lived it most fully, even knowing what it cost. That understanding, earned through everything the Skywalker name implies, is the answer. Sleep well,